everyone. Thank you for joining this session of the Impact Series. I'm Miko McGinty. I'm a JE grad and a grad of the Yale School of Art. And I am here today and I get to talk with Nancy Yao Maasbach, president of the Museum of Chinese in America. She was previously executive director of the Yale-China Association. She has an MBA from the Yale School of Management and an AB from Occidental College. She is an original member of the Here and Now Theater Company and is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. I just wanted to start and say that I am here in Brooklyn, and my living land acknowledgement recognizes the indigenous peoples who've been dispossessed from this place, the Munsee, Lenape, and the Canarsie. Nancy.
Hi, Miko. It's so great. And I also acknowledge on the land that we are on that was also Munsee, Lenape, and how important it is to, to really recognize those who are on this land before we were blessed to then move on to it. But thank you so much. This is so great. Miko, you're the best person to talk to. And I, although I'm a little nervous, I feel like we'll be able to really get to the heart of things. And, thanks for having me.
Yeah, as you know, I had so many questions for you. I had to edit them down a little bit, but I thought we should start. I thought we should start with your story, your personal family story.
Yeah, it's I'm at the museum now, at the Museum of Chinese in America, and we've had occasion to get together in Chinatown and at banquets and community organization events and things like that. And it's really interesting when I was preparing for this and thinking about our interactions and how we were at banquets, and that's where we first met, in Chinatown at a banquet.
Yeah.
And I will say, so much of my upbringing and my family story is around being a Chinese immigrant. As the child of Chinese immigrants, my mother really, on the day that she lived in America, one day longer than she had lived in a Chinese speaking country, I gave her a subscription to Newsweek. And I said, Mom, maybe it's time you should really start learning English. And it's one of those, just that connection with so much Chineseness in my upbringing, so traditional, but then only really recognizing how traditional my upbringing was after I started at the museum. It's just such a part of my makeup and my sense of being born and raised in New York City. We did everything. My mom was always trying to be helpful to create a better life. Like when people talk about immigrants wanting a better life, like my mother every year thought of new ideas to make a better life. And how that translated was about 15 different startup ventures, and not startup like fancy private equity venture capital startups. It's like, let's sell pen watches. No, pen watches aren't selling. Let's sell Rubik's Cubes. No, that's not a good idea. Let's open a pizzeria. Everyone loves pizza. And my questions are always like, okay, Mommy, how can I help? But then I'm like, wait, you don't even eat pizza. And how would you learn how to make pizza? But it was this sense of like, we can do anything in America. And I will say, my father had, a very traditional job. He was a bookkeeper / accountant at Pan American. But the reason he did that was really because we could get free airfare so that we could go back to Asia every summer and visit my grandmother who was in Taiwan. And so, a lot of what, we spoke Chinese at home, and we still speak Chinese at home now. And it's been a very traditional Chinese upbringing. And in some ways, people used to characterize the individuals who left mainland China in 1949 and then went to Taiwan and then came to the US in the 70s. There was something when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s in Queens and Flushing that there was a pride point. It was like, we're the most traditional Chinese because we weren't influenced by mainland Chinese communism. And that, the Cultural Revolution burned so many books of intellectuals, but we still had traditional characters. We still had traditional culture. And that in some ways, the Chinese who were in New York City in the 70s, there was a pride point that they were the most traditional Chinese in the world. Yeah. So, and I think I kind of really infused that into how I think about my work today and, where am I and who am I?
I've been really interested in people's ancestral biographies lately, thanks to Yale alum Dr. Cheryl Grills and Enola Aird. They wrote ancestral biographies that they mingled with their professional biographies, and I found that to be really moving and surprising. And of course, like so true that our professional lives and our personal lives can be intertwined, especially like going far back in our histories. So I think you are an embodiment of this for sure. And I was wondering if you could talk a little more about like further back, your further back ancestral.
Yeah, my parents were arranged, and they're 14 years apart, and they weren't arranged, and they were arranged by someone match made them. Their families were both sort of familiar with each other. My father came from a very, I guess, a prominent Shanghainese family, but his father died when he was very, very young. So he was 2 or 3 and raised by a single mother. But his mother's brother was a prominent Shanghainese congressperson. And he was kind of like one of the mayors of Shanghai. And he also he was a journalist. So he started one of the first Chinese American newspapers in the US. So his last name is Pan, Pan. And in essence, there's a Chinese tradition that if your father dies, your mother's brother ends up being this default father figure. And my Chinese name is named by Uncle Pan, grand Uncle Pan named me and my brother. And he was the one who brought my father over in 1950s. But the Pan family has a very long ancestral legacy in Shanghai. They were, prominent scholars. And that part of it is really the legacy of their work. And then it went into this sort of journalistic type of field and civil society and being a part of it. So it's quite interesting that the story is also complex because they left China a little earlier. And as a public figure, sometimes you should have stayed. People didn't know. Like in hindsight, we know what happened during the Civil War, but there was a little bit of people left early. Maybe that wasn't the best thing to do. So you're sort of abandoning ship. So there's a lot of stories about the ancestral site that ended up closing because of this. I would kind of characterize as some element of shame. So what happens in that process is the stories start closing. People don't talk about it. And what's interesting on my mother's side, something similar happened, and maybe this is just wartime. My grandfather, my mother's father, was a 2-star general for the Nationalist Party. And as we know, in Civil War, many of them fled to Taiwan. And a lot of the generals were living in this one neighborhood in Taipei. And I was like, oh, I actually met a descendant of another general who was their neighbor. And I said, oh, you must have known my mother's family. And the grandfather said, we didn't talk to each other because we had just lost China.
Right. So
these generals were all living in the same neighborhood, but no one had interaction because, as you can imagine, the Civil War had just, they've left their home. They're all on this small island, Taiwan, which is in their mind a province. So no one's having fun neighborly interactions with each other, right? And they're not talking about anything. So, I really love to think back at even that was 3 generations. And what happened though in the process of all that, the Civil War, is that the shame ends up closing the history books a bit. And what we're really trying to do at MOCA is understanding that very heaviness that existed and kind of reopening that a bit. It is really dangerous water. I mean, it is rocky waters for people, and they've hidden it. So I definitely know that my mother is actually of Manchu ancestry. So Manchus were a minority group and from northern China, and they were the leading minority of the Qing dynasties that last from 1644 till the end of dynastic rule in 1911. 1901 is the founding of Yale-China, so I always 1911. So she's Manchu, and my grandfather and some of my mother's brothers have extremely fair complexions and hair and eyes. So they have a little bit of what they think is northern or Chinese, Russian, ancestral blood. And my father has one of the oldest surnames is Yao. So on his father's side, goes back generations and generations in Shanghai. So a very Chinese mainland, story that's been all mixed up with the Civil War and now in America.
And we were just talking a little bit about Asian Americans living in the US, or, you know, the post-immigrant story, that sometimes those histories, I mean, you're saying it in terms of the museum, like collecting those histories and opening them up, but really also thinking about, you know, it makes me think about when I was at Yale undergrad and I went and spent a couple weeks with my grandparents who were interned during World War II. And I really tried to get them to talk about it, Japanese American internment. And they just like shut it down, like a little and then no, and then a little and then no. It was really hard to get them to talk sort of generally. My great aunt was a lot more talkative. So
There's always one. There's always one that's talking.
yeah, she told all the stories later. So one thing I wanted to bring up again, that you talked about the owning a restaurant. So an element of your family, that's an element of your family story. The dean of the Asian American Cultural Center on campus, Dean Juliana Lee, told me recently that a lot of the current students share this with you. They're from restaurant families. And I was thinking maybe you could speak a little bit to them and to all of us about the history and meaning of restaurant ownership.
You know, I'm so proud of the fact that we owned a pizzeria in Queens. And the funny thing about the name of the pizzeria was New Day. It's a new day. I was like, that makes so much sense. And it was like an inspiring thing for me, even though basically we went bankrupt. I mean, it was a very failing business. And I always said, like, if I had been able to, if I was a little older, I could have been more helpful. I was like between the ages of 7 and 11. And like, we'd go every weekend to like the before Costco existed, there was this thing called Western Beef. And we'd go there and we'd like plug in all this stuff. And my mom had no idea. It was pizza and cold cuts and, you know, a deli type things. My mother had never had a deli sandwich in her life to this day. And I remember seeing her try to make a sandwich when someone ordered it, and I'm just like, she has no idea. But the sandwiches she would make me going to school were like a stale bagel with butter and mayonnaise with beef shreds. If anyone in Chinese, like lo song, and I would open up the sandwich and starving. I was like, oh my God, what is this? You know. So, but restaurant ownership is for I think from the historic scholarly component, there's a lot written about restaurants and hand laundries really being jobs that Chinese people in this country during the exclusion period of 1882, especially to 1943, but also then till 1965, there was just so many jobs. It was the jobs that people didn't want, right? And so it was a low barrier to entry, no barrier to entry, because nobody wanted these jobs. And also they're labor jobs. They're like things that you can do with your body, with your hands. You don't need English. And you know, that barrier to entry, a lot of people say, oh, well, how come, you know, certain other groups have been so much more successful sooner? And, you know, language is a big barrier to entry, you know, to success. And even so, what we do see is that even when their English hasn't been a barrier to entry in the 60s and 70s, when you saw a lot of Taiwan students from Taiwan and Hong Kong coming to the US to study grad school and do an engineering degree. There was like a default like rite of passage to work in a restaurant. And, you know, it was easy. It was, you know, tips, you know, it was cash, you know, it was something you could figure out. You could work hard, you could be, you know, studious, and you could also be very hardworking and still make some money and not have to go through all these barriers. Like they couldn't get an internship at the Met. Let's just say that, right? There's just so many things you can do. And, you know, for myself, even, you know, when I was in high school, I was working at Bob's Big Boy. I was a waitress. I probably worked about 28 hours a week. And it did two things for me. It gave me disposable income. And, you know, Bob's Big Boy, people don't think about it as like a lucrative job, but there's so much turnover that I made more money in one summer than my dad made at his job as an accountant at Pan Am. And I just remember that day, I was like, this is so strange to me, because I knew how much he made on a, you know, annual basis. And that's the type of thing. But the second thing on that is that, you know, you learned this sort of, I learned American culture in some ways. I never really used a fork and a knife before I worked at Bob's Big Boy. Like we always had a bowl of rice, 2 dishes and a soup and chopsticks at our dining room table.
Yeah.
And we always sat together and we had a meal. We always waited till my father ate first, and that's just it was a very traditional Chinese upbringing. I didn't know much more than that. And when they're like, okay, what's a Western omelet? I have no idea what a Western omelet is. So I remember like bringing the menu home and actually studying the menu. And to this day, like I have such fond memories of Bob's Big Boy. And it's also taught me how to interact with people.
Yeah.
Because I had this bizarre sort of extremely shy, introverted personality, but then I had to be outgoing to get bigger tips. It was a very practical,
Yeah.
mentality.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of folks really saw easy entry, no barriers, and disposable income, and accepted, like I could do as well as I could do by how hard I worked.
Yeah.
It was like there's this phrase in Chinese, like be your own boss. And there's so much about like, I can be my own boss here.
Yeah.
If I work in a restaurant, it's my company. And then there are other people who are models for how this works.
Yeah.
And they've been successful. And I'm hardworking too. So I will be successful.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you see this in different Asian American groups in terms of certain sort of be your own boss, whether it's a Korean market,
Right.
and yeah, it's really interesting.
Well, this sort of leads to your current job. Well, we can make a bridge from from your young employment to your today your leadership. I was thinking we should have you tell everyone about the museum a little bit, like how it was founded, what its intent is, the programming, the goals, just to, I don't want to assume that everyone knows that already. I think we should have, and also to hear it from the president, it's like a really good way to hear about it in institutions.
I mean, thank you for sharing about your family and, internment. And I think a lot about that, having gone to school on the West Coast and really been exposed to those stories and that narrative, and also being so shocked that it wasn't really taught to me in the classrooms when I was growing up. Not at all. I mean, I didn't know about internment until I was at Occidental College in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
And I didn't know that there were 2, 3, 4, 5 generations of Japanese, in America.
Yeah.
And that they had suffered through that. And that I think was the first sort of like planting the seed. And that Here Now Theater Company that I mentioned, we basically covered those types of stories and we brought them to the stage. It was an Asian American acting troupe. We wrote our own works. We performed them on topics like Japanese internment, on topics like model minority myth, on Vincent Chin, and some of those things, because you wanted to make them accessible. And, so that really was my formative years in thinking about what does justice look like? What does the American narrative really look like? Where's my place in this whole thing? Like, why have, and there's so much racism going on today against so many groups, BIPOC groups. And I think at this moment, it's particularly pronounced towards Asian American Pacific Islanders.
Yeah.
And, I fundamentally believe that the Museum of Chinese in America needs to fully exist in a very permanent space where it can be a museum that helps to supplement what's not being taught in classrooms from this Chinese American journey. And again, I often say, like, it's not like it's our turn. It's definitely not about that. It wasn't like the Japanese okay, it's time to talk about Japanese internment. It's time to talk about Black Lives Matter. It's time to, that's for me, and I may be too, just passionate about this. It's time to talk about the American narrative and how the whole thing has to be rewritten. And all these bits and pieces that are like percolating up, we cannot forget George Floyd. Like, we cannot forget BLM. Yeah, we cannot forget Japanese internment. We cannot forget the Holocaust. We cannot forget, Chinese exclusion. But some of these things, like, you have to start learning about them before you can actually forget them. And so the Museum of Chinese America is all about Chinese Exclusion Act and the aftermath, and also the successes of Chinese Americans in that journey, but also the bigger mission, because the word Chinese isn't in our mission statement. This is all about the American narrative and helping to redefine it. And for anyone who comes into the museum, for them to have a better sense of themselves when they come out of that. And that's the purpose of it, to say, there's an American story and there's a big part that's missing. And it's not because it's our turn. It's because you excluded a group of people to come in after they helped build the railroad that connected the country, that then, really created the platform for its growth over the next 150, 200 years. And then there was massive discrimination and killings, and it just continues today. And that anti-AAPI hate today is fundamentally based on that sense of Asians, because of the way we look, that they're foreigners, that they somehow carry the Chinese flu, that they somehow are part of the Wuhan flu, Kung flu, whatever the past administration wanted to call it, to then further jeopardize, Asian American Pacific Islanders' safety in this country that they call home.
Yeah.
So it's a museum of conscience.
Yeah.
It's a museum that's trying to do its part in telling some of those stories, because the stories, they call for reckoning. It's just they're so unknown, and it's so important to bring it out. But then it's also a place for young generations to have confidence in trying to learn about themselves more, and to understand who they are and their identity, and to give strength to it, and to celebrate, and to cultivate artistry, based on stories that are ones that, so many people come in, they're like, I never knew that. I hear that I never knew that. And I was like, yeah, I'm sorry. I think I have a better response, because it's always like, I had no idea. And these are teachers, and they're like, very, every part of the spectrum. Like, I had no idea.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's hard.
Well, so in January of last year, there was a fire in your archive, in your storage. It threatened a huge amount of your archive. You've already talked a little bit about how, like, you're trying to surface stories through families. What happened in the fire? It made all the news. We were definitely paying attention. I think the New York City community was paying attention, and it was a very dramatic and scary, and I think people really understand in their hearts that losing your family archives is scary or painful, or something that that happens at times. But this was like a whole institution sort of under threat at that.
Yeah, the way you just said it, it conjured up all those emotions from that night and from that period of time. And because it was about the families, how the team felt was completely wrecked. We were wrecked because we had a responsibility.
Yeah.
And those I just, like, those first days were just so it was just, maybe I'll like, we had a period of time when our family was had gone through a very deep financial hardship, and I was right out of college, so we had to put everything basically into the garage and move into a small apartment, and basically had lost pretty much everything, and I was young, and I wanted to be helpful, so I had a garage sale. I thought, okay, we need money, and all this stuff is in this garage. But I kind of disconnected the fact that these were things that we wanted, because I just thought they were all in a garage and they were piling up. And then all these people started coming to want to buy things, but they were actually our things that we kind of wanted. It wasn't like things I wanted. But my parents were, of course, like thinking, oh, she's trying to be helpful, so so then I remember I sold a box, just like a standard box of, moving box of little figurines that I remember growing up with on this glass shelf that my parents had, and they were like from China. There were some bronze, some of the old, bronze things, and they were, just like very things that they had carried over. That story just continues to haunt me. And someone bought it, and I remember it wasn't for a lot of money. I just sold the whole box.
Yeah.
Because I wasn't thinking, and I was trying to be helpful. And that night, I just remember that box. I just kept remembering that box. And I was like, I just let everyone's box just burn down.
Yeah.
And so it was like, those are the things and then they had the wherewithal to to actually say this is valuable, right? Like at that moment in the garage sale, I was like, oh, we don't need this. We just have to clean it out. We just have to start new, new day, new day. But they had the wherewithal to say, this is valuable. I want the museum to hold it, right?
Yeah.
Or also the early founders, Jack Chen, Charlie Lai and Jack Chen, they had collected them and saw value in them. So, huge respect for their pioneering efforts. And also the teams of people that collected thereafter. The fire left us hopeless, but with the help of so many different organizations and groups and individuals and people helping nationally and just supporting it, we were able to salvage 98% of the collections, but the conservation part is real. I mean, it's like 5 years of conservation. We haven't even finished the assessment on the conservation. The assessment is taking 6 months. The stabilization took all year.
Yeah.
And then Ming Thompson, who's a Yale College grad, she actually designed a temporary space for us to rehouse everything. So she's amazing, this beautiful space that we can use it for scholarship and for students to visit. 3 Howard Street, everyone come by. And so but what I think the team is so incredible, because instead of like burying our heads under a rock, we just kept supporting each other and pivoting and figuring out how to do this. And I think the big message that what I was really trying to say is, a lot of people want to help right now, right? And this is something that is hard, but it's an organizational thing that I feel is an ethical decision also. It's sort of like, you need to be mindful of how people want to help. And one, you need to thank them. But two, you can't take advantage of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that part sort of like, we wanted to make sure that we were being good stewards of people's gifts, whether they be financial or their gifts of time. And for me, as the head of an organization, and as I think about the accolades we've gotten and a lot of other things, I never want to take advantage of an opportunity and not be a good steward of what people are doing for us. And that has been the hardest thing. And I've kept trying to remind the team of that, like, how do we give back, especially as a nonprofit? Like, how do you take a situation where we've gotten so much attention around the fire?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, amazing attention. But then at the same time, sometimes I worry that people are, foundations and other groups are checking the box and saying, okay, we're supporting MOCA. So that means our AAPI quota is filled. Right. And that's not okay. And so like, I'll be very outspoken about that. And just like, one, that is harmful to MOCA, because people think we're just trying to like selfishly do it just for ourselves.
Right.
And that's not it. This has to be a broader American narrative. That's what we're talking about here. Like the bigger problem, we have to keep our eyes on the bigger issue here, and for us, the bigger issue is getting the new museum up and running. And then the bigger issue is contributing to a redefined American narrative. Like if we stray with all the noise around us and not focus on that, or just take the little things that are like kind of thrown at us, or like the quota check the box stuff that MOCA's getting, and not shout it out for those two big things, then we're not doing anyone any service. We actually mission stray from then what we're trying to do. And that's so hard, and it's so nuanced, right? And it's hard to even explain, but that's like, there's so many distractions in the world today around the mission. And I constantly, share with the team, I was like, we cannot mission stray. This is about redefining the narrative.
And there are other cultural institutions in New York and all over the US that are sort of parallels or have related related goals to yours, but for different groups. I mean, the Japanese American Museum. We're going to talk in a moment about the program you did last summer, but El Museo del Barrio, the Africa Center, the Jewish Museum, where I do a lot of work at the New York Jewish Museum. And, so that I feel like what you're acknowledging in this is that you're part of like an ecosystem also, and taking care of each other and taking care of the other institutions matters.
It really does. And it's not easy, and it's not obvious, because the resources for all nonprofits and all the institutions you mentioned are scarce.
Yeah.
Right. And it's really hard to raise. I think the systemic issue is the funding for history museums, for arts and culturals, for grassroots, artist organizations. We need to have a better system overall on how those things are funded, right? And then I will say, again, I need to be honest, the larger institutions that are well funded need to do a better job, I think, in managing the funding they get and how they spend it. Just because they get it doesn't mean they're managing it well. And I've only looked at, because I used to do a forensic accounting and things like that. I've looked at a lot of financials, and I wonder, how disproportionate the funding is, and also maybe sometimes as you get bigger, you lose sight of the struggle. So right now, MOCA, like everyone on the team, we only have 13 full-time people. We're doing 10 to 12 things each, right? We don't have a development office, right? So people are always like, oh, get your development team. And I'm just sort of like laughing because you're like looking at the development team. And it's like me and, Melissa Wong, who writes most of our grants, who also leverages Herb Tam and everybody else, Lauren, like there's no team in anything we do. There's one person that's like 10 teams. And then, and then you look at these like roster of jobs at other large institutions, and there's like one person doing accounts payable. And I'm like, one person's doing accounts payable? Like, which is like neither scenario is good, right? But there's something in the middle, and I think there needs to be a better infrastructure, but we need to support each other. But then it's hard because we're these creatures, and it's like we need mom and dad sometimes, or someone to say, wait. It's almost like you need an integrity check or ethics check. There's like something where just like, wait, are you thinking about the bigger picture? But everyone's bigger picture, we so easily mission stray. And it's like, that's why I have it on my bulletin board, I have that on my bulletin board, like, don't mission stray. And then I have this on my bulletin board. It's really hard to deal with crazy people. So don't mission stray and don't try to deal with crazy people.
I see a lot of in the art world, we're working with Art and Practice in Los Angeles, and they've been doing a lot of partnerships. They're partnering with the Getty, they've partnered with the Hammer, they've partnered with Baltimore Museum of Art, and I've enjoyed seeing that. I've also been hearing more about foundation, like really big granting foundations trying to pull together more of the groups, and maybe they're like the parent figure in this story. I know you have had some good foundation support this year, and maybe they'll be able to help with that kind of gluiness across all of the cultural institutions.
The foundations, some of them have just stepped up so incredibly, and it's even in conversation. So how I felt in years past was, I had to be the good student. I had to pretend everything was okay, and I just, look, we can do it. Well, if you give us money, we'll do a really good job. Promise, 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 like that type of feeling. And I have to shout out Mellon Foundation, because they basically had a conversation with us. And in the conversation, they actually said, Nancy, like, kind of like, I don't remember the exact words, but like, don't be afraid to just tell us how it really is.
Yeah.
And I said, wait, like, it's like, what do you mean? Like it's almost like imposter syndrome, right? What do you mean? Everything's great. And you're like, in your head, you're like, everything is really falling apart. But they were like, no, it's okay. And they said it over and over again, like, we're here, we're going to partner with you. Yeah. And it was everything, like, we had to assess how much damage was in the collections. Yeah. Right. And we're like, we can do it in 6 weeks. And because we were like not going to sleep, we were going to get every volunteer in the world in the middle of the pandemic. And they're like, it's impossible for you to do this in 6 weeks. And I said, no, we can do it. We have this thing called MOCA Sudo, which we do things really fast and really, really well. And they're like, time out. No, you can't. And we're with you, Nancy. Right. Yeah. And then what happens is, I stopped being this imposter, right? And I stopped pretending, not saying the things that I like, should be saying. And then I'm honestly saying, we are overwhelmed. We have no idea how to begin the conservation. And the real assessment that we got is 6 months, right?
Yeah.
And and even in 6 months, I'm worried that Yama the head might get really burned out. And
Right.
but but the fact that Melon was like, time out, just be honest.
Yeah.
And it's not me sort of like, please, 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 I'll be good. It's the power, right?
Yeah.
It's all about the power. And
Yeah.
they empowered us, right? And then the same thing with the Ford and America's 20 Cultural Treasures. They picked 20 of us. We had no idea they were doing this.
Yeah.
It was literally like the household sweepstakes thing when they knock on your door. And I was like, what do you mean? They're like, you won the publisher clearing house. I was like, what? But did I really? And like literally that's what it was. And it was a 15-minute conversation and I was bawling for 13 minutes.
Yeah.
Literally bawling my eyes out for 13 minutes. And it's like you're doing good work and it's important and we see you, right? And then but we want to be responsible also, so then we've been like, okay, how can we help other boats rise?
Right.
So we're also giving out honorariums to the other like consortium building thing, so for $2,500 for each of the Chinese historicals that we've been working with, just to give them a little bit of a boost up, from the funds. We want to do it for Asian American artist groups and try to figure that out. That being all said, we also need money because we're trying to, stabilize and be permanent. So it's a struggle, but there's a return on all of this, which is, well, if we're all stronger, we're all stronger.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it'll work itself out.
I think that the foundation's stepping up. I mean, I think it's tied to also the summer and the summer of protests and awareness raised, across the whole US. And it's really heartening in the arts and culture sector. I did want to talk a little bit about what happened this summer. And so starting after the fire, so you've had the fire, now here comes the COVID-19 and the beginning of the hate crimes against Asian Pacific Islanders sort of started in the beginning. I know you guys were working on that and thinking about that right away, and it was happening and you were hearing about it. And then the George Floyd protests started this summer too. And so, immediately after the protests began, we saw daily protesting here in New York City. So it was really vivid for those of us who were here and for the institution. And we saw this national movement to fight racism experienced in the Black community. And you immediately launched a series hosted by the Museum of Chinese in America called the MOCA Forum, Asian American Allyship for Black Lives Matter. So I wanted to ask you sort of about that arc of programming from this sort of beginning of the shutdown and through that series.
Yeah, no, it's when I was in second grade, I remember I had to do a Lunar New Year thing in front of all the students. And so I was talking about, I think it was a year of the pig or something. And I had to talk about it. And I was sort of making half of it up because I only knew what I knew. And then they wanted me to talk. And that was, Lunar New Year's and usually January or a bit. And then I remember the next week, since I was the only minority in the class, I was asked to play Rosa Parks, in this school play. And it was interesting, having that very early experience around being the minority in the classroom and for everything. And but having grown up in New York City and in a very diverse neighborhood and very, low income, area. It was on the outskirts of Flushing. It really kind of it makes me racism makes me just it makes me boil. It makes me baffled. It makes me just feel so hopeless, and yet I think it's really hard to think about how you can make a difference. So
Mhm.
that's kind of like, since I've grown up with so much racism and saw it inflicted on some of my dearest friends, and have been in situations, it, like I have trouble doing a knee-jerk reaction to certain um, broader issues. So we wanted to try to do something thoughtful. I guess that's the answer to that. We wanted to do something where it had nothing to do with MOCA. This has to do with BLM. So we quickly issued a statement around that, and not, again, not about leveraging it, an opportunity,
Right.
and I think that that's the part that it needs to be so careful, because I think a lot of GoFundMe's are terrific, and if there's a need, there's a need. But then there has to be a purpose for those funds. And I think that that's a little bit of my weird pet peeve. And like someone said, oh, you guys should set up a GoFundMe after the fire. And we really hesitated to do that because we didn't want people to get the impression that we were sort of leveraging this opportunity. And with
Right.
BLM, the same thing. It's so sensitive. I mean, really, to understand what is in the world is happening and why is it still happening. So we were very clear, consensus wide, board and team, we must issue something that says there's systemic injustice here, and
Mhm.
it needs to be radically reversed, and there need to be proper next steps taken to fix the system. So we did that without saying, and by the way, there's a MOCA program on how to make lanterns. Like, we didn't want to do something. It was just like, no good. This is terrible. Those deaths, their names need to be known. All of the work that that we need to support that as a society. And then we really thought, how can we actually think about allyship?
Right.
And it's not going to. And of course, we have a mutual wonderful friend, Connie Royster, who is just amazing. And she's like, she made the point, and I've been saying it over and over again, which is, you cannot go to your Black and African American friends and make them the explainers in chief.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's like, that's racist, right? Like, that's actually assuming something about, it's like assuming that I know kung fu. It's assuming that, like, I know anything about the Lunar New Year celebration. It's assuming
Right.
I understand US-China relations or the cross-strait relationship. Like, it's, you cannot, you must educate yourself. And that's the part that we wanted to place forward,
Yeah.
that we're going to have conversations that help inform us. And I did one with Precious O'Dooney, a Yale
Right.
grad, and
Yeah.
a dear friend of ours. And we had never talked. We've been friends for years. Precious and her husband Ori and my husband and I were like, and a few others. We're all really good friends, and we've gotten together at major milestones. And I said, Precious, would you do this conversation with me? She's like, we've never talked about this before. I was like, I know. So
And that was the allyship, right? That was the
right,
conversation on
right.
allyship. Yeah.
And we just basically had a live conversation for the first time, talking about these issues, because it never really, we all have always had cultural differences and how we were brought up and all that. We talked about that. I know a lot about her family, her upbringing in Houston, yeah, all these things, but like, we never, and we had this conversation, and it was, we wanted to model it, if you will.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I feel like at the time you wrote something in an email to a group of us and Connie, and you were highlighting the all-in movement for Black Lives Matter, and I thought that was really beautiful at the time, and I still do. I think that your audience is reaching, and the Asian American community, and so that was a really important leadership moment for the museum to say, here we are. This is about educate yourselves, learn how to be an ally. This is our obligation as people fighting racism in
And it's
America.
hard because there's a lot of intergenerational differences in the Chinese American community. There are a lot of misperceptions around, there's a kind of a sentiment. There are a lot of tensions around this topic. So we really felt that it was sometimes misinformed, and we needed to present more information.
Yeah.
And something like, they're like, wait, why do you want to defund the police? But like, defunding the police in and of itself is confusing to most people. Like,
Yeah.
they don't even understand what that means. And then they're like, we need police to protect us because they're attacking us. So like, the 1+1 wasn't equaling 2. It was just sort of like these phrases. And again, that's because sometimes English isn't your native language.
Yeah.
There's it's, and there's, I should, this is like a perfect example. When we were growing up, we only spoke Chinese.
Yeah.
And there's a phrase in Chinese, it's nega, right? It's a Chinese word for that. But
Okay.
it's also like the word like, right? It's like, it's a filler word.
Hmm.
And I remember someone thought that we were using the N word
Hmm.
and referring to
Hmm.
that person when we were speaking Chinese. And we had no idea why there was a belligerence around it. Years later, my husband said to me, "Oh, why do your parents keep using the N word?" And I was like, "What are you talking about? My parents never use that word." And then he said the word in Chinese, and I was like, "That's a Chinese phrase for that." But every time he heard it, he thought my parents were saying something derogatory about Black people. And so like I kind of brought that up a couple of times, and they're like, "Oh, we've had the same situation."
Yeah.
It's interesting. It's like, and that word is like the word like, it's a filler word. And so you
Yeah.
hear it a lot in
Yeah.
Chinese. But
Yeah.
if anyone who's, Black or sensitive to, and they walk past and they think they're talking about that person, it's one of these like things that like, oh my goodness. But when it came together, literally just 15 years ago was the first time I had any cognizance around the fact that this was probably something that was a catalyst.
Yeah.
I was like, "Oh my goodness." And I don't know how do you explain that to people? And I'm doing it now, but like,
You fit now. I mean, I think that's the answer. I mean, I was, like I said, I have way too many questions, so I know we're going to have to wrap up in a moment. But I wanted to bring up here the, I've been really interested in the Suru for Solidarity movement, which is about Japanese American communities fighting mass incarceration and race-based immigration roundups and camps and family camps. And, so I feel like there's a lot of education happening in that Japanese American community because of the parallels of the experience. And so that's part of that education piece. And I think also because the Japanese American community got together to fight for redress or reparations, and this awareness about the question of reparations for slavery in America, so you feel like this like cultural resonance that helps you dig into other histories and other situations today or yesterday. And I kind of think that might be one of the areas of learning that we can all do.
I like that through line a lot, because I think, I mean, on a personal basis, we need to do, I just think we need to provide massive reparations. And it's not even, it's the amount and how soon is so great, and need for I just it's
Yeah.
and there needs to be a lot of effort into thinking that through. Like, a lot of funding and effort needs to be thought sooner than later. And that's across the board for a number of groups that have suffered dramatically.
Yeah, the apology was so meaningful in my family, the letter of apology. So
Oh,
that from the president,
yeah.
So I guess I also just wanted to ask you sort of an interesting, a little harder question before we go to like our wrap up. Okay, so if you're interested in solidarity and allyship, but you're not someone who's able to like make a big bold statement on social media, maybe that's a little hard for you. Like, what are forms of allyship and solidarity that you could do or that you're seeing through the constituency of your museum? Or, what could someone do who's like just sort of starting to think about allyship?
Yeah, that's well, the museum, again, we're very focused, even on the anti-AAPI stuff now. It's
Yeah.
there's a lot going on there, but
Yeah.
we really I encourage the team to pause to think about what is our responsibility, because if we get too worked up in thinking about what everyone else is doing, or where the pressure points are in terms of, we've added our names to things,
Mhm.
but what do we do, right? And I think what we keep thinking is we have to document. So all of these things are happening, and we know that if you don't document and you don't record, then there's no history. And when you don't have history, you can't go back and say that happened and that was for these reasons. So we started this whole One World COVID-19 collection in April of last year to record. And at that point, it was like recording the massive sort of networks that were created to provide PPP when people needed it and couldn't have it. And it was like Yale-China Association working with the hospitals in Shanghai, Shanghai Hospital in Changsha, and like getting all of these together and then going through Hong Kong and sending all this PPP when we didn't have it. And like sort of celebrating that Chinese network, that guanxi that was able to really mobilize and serve a need. But then we also recorded the young woman who created the poster that said, "I am not a virus." So we collected a lot of those things and went back to the organizations to write down their oral history, to obtain videos and artifacts around this period of time and really collect them. And so our job and really is saying, like, we need to record the history, because it's not going to be useful if we're just one other person doing one small thing in the mix of like 1,000 people, including Daniel Day Kim and Philip Lim and Jeremy Lin doing things. Like, it's not where, I mean, it's much more, no one else is putting it down and collecting it. So MOCA, we said, let's not, again, lose sight of what we're supposed to do, and feel pressure to be loud, or out front on everything. Like, that's not our job now. And so I think, that's really, really important to send that message out. And as far as like specific allyship is, we have more time now. People are doing it. And I know we're all in a 1-year rut with this quarantine. But I really commit, I commit to reading now 1 book a week, this year on issues around, allyship, informing myself and educating myself. There are so many amazing books out there right now. And pieces are getting written, and really take to heart, I was in someone wanted me to join a study group at a local church, and just to sort of see what I thought about the conversation. And I was shocked, but it was a lot of senior citizen women, and they had never heard the phrase white privilege before. But sort of understanding where people are, and being in conversations where you might have discomfort, but just trying to understand where people are is we need to create more bridges. And if someone's like, listen, I grew up in, Connecticut my whole life, and I went to this one church and my kids went to this one school, and I've never heard the phrase white privilege before. That's not the person lying. That's the truth of her experience. But that she's in this book club reading Caste and reading, how to be anti-racist. And, those are important lifelong decisions and journeys, and we can't put them down. Like, how could you not know what white privilege is? You have to celebrate the fact that she's reading the book, right, as a 78-year-old. And I think the big theme line for me, and what I keep reminding myself, is we need to meet people where they are. If we don't serve as a bridge, if we don't meet people where they are, if we don't admit that we don't know, but sometimes you don't even know that we don't know, it's so Socratic, then there's going to be no progress. And then we also have to hold ourselves accountable to what is our job in the bigger mission of what we're trying to do. And that part's really hard for me as an org.
I feel like I've been trying to attend talks like this to hear the language. So there's the books. I mean, we talked about Caste before this. It's such an incredible book, but I also really appreciate like tuning into a conversation about Caste, because then I can hear the language in people's mouths, like people who are comfortable talking about it and people who aren't, and like how the language is going to help, how the conversation and having the vocabulary is going to help change the way people think, exactly like the person in your group who's there and gets to talk to you about it and have a conversation. And so much of it is sort of hearing how things are phrased and how people are using language to talk about it, and sort of absorbing it, and then being able to turn and do that outward again to somebody else.
And Miko, I'm so glad you said that, because also, the big elephant in the room with all these conversations is that there's a barrier to entry to understanding these conversations. I mean, if your native language is in English, if you haven't been exposed to some of this, you can easily and quickly offend someone. And that's like, how do you get your, your more conservative, traditional, XYZ grandparent,
Mhm.
not my situation, but, to understand some of these issues around that's, the subtlety of even in the English language.
Yeah.
There's so many nuances and subtleties in it. This is a sophisticated, intellectualized conversation, right? Generally. And let's not forget that, because it's, my mom, I'm waiting for Cass to get translated into Chinese. I
Yeah.
think my mom will love it, but there's no way she can get past the preface,
Yeah.
um, and that, and she's someone who's very sympathetic and is, incredibly, embraces the diversity of this country and sees herself as 100% American and still 100% Chinese, right?
Yeah.
So, but I think that that's the big part that's tricky, for all of us, and we listening and understanding and giving people a little bit of the benefit of the doubt, I feel like is maybe more of that would be helpful too.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much
Oh
for
my
this
God,
conversation. I really did have like 8 more questions, but we are going to get
that
to
is too much. Uh, no, Miko,
um,
you're awesome, and you're so, your advocacy and your thoughtfulness. It's I should interview you. That's Yale alumni. We should interview Miko. She's the one doing the heavy lift. But thank you so much. And
Oh, thank you so
thanks.
much. I really believe that the thing about all the language and hearing people talk these things through and talk in groups and talk to people they trust. And I think that's like one of a big step that everyone can take. And it's not as scary as maybe speaking out yourself in some sort of more public forum. And I guess I'm going to say right now that we have more Impact Series content, and visit the Yale Alumni Association website and the channels, and to hear the other talks with some of the other incredible alumni and speakers, and to hear the language and the thinking, just like this talk. So, but across all diverse groups and ages and everything. So Nancy, thank you so much.
So much. We're gonna get there. I feel good about this, and thanks to Yale for even thinking of doing this. It's a great idea.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, everyone, Whaley and everyone.
Okay,
Bye.
thank you. All right, take care.